Today, the December 8th, Sayadaw has been giving talk for a few days already. And Sayadaw explained earlier on two principles. The first one is that if one does not know the correct method of practice, then one should dispel not knowing by learning the correct method of practice. And the second one is, if one does not discern the things that should be discerned, one should remove not knowing by being mindful in order to discern. And Sayadaw had explained on these two principles. So in order to discern the things that should be discerned, one should be noting the objects that are arising at the sixth sense door. In the sixth sense door, there are nama, rupa, mentality and materiality arising. And in order to explain, Sayadaw explained the three elements: the receptor element, the striker element, and the ignition element. And Sayadaw explained the example of hearing, which is very obvious. At the moment of hearing, the three elements, receptor element, striker element, and the ignition element are present. There is no person, there is no being, no I, no soul that is hearing. What is really present are the nama and rupa arising at the moment of hearing. So in the hearing, Sayadaw explained these three elements. In the hearing, one hears the sound with the ear. As much the ear sensitivity is good, the person can hear clearly. If the person is short of hearing, then the person will not hear well. So if the ear sensitivity is weak, the person cannot hear properly. And also in the hearing, there are sound waves that are striking the ear base. So nobody can deny the fact that they are not sound waves. So when the sound waves strike the ear base over and over again, then the person will be hearing each sound one after another, and there will be hearing consciousness. In the hearing, the nama that arises, that are obvious, are the hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling. The hearing consciousness and the sound come into contact in the ear, and phassa contact takes place, and there is hearing feeling. If the person hears pleasant sound, there will be pleasant feeling. If the person hears unpleasant sound, there will be unpleasant feeling. So at the time of hearing, the nama, mentality, that are obvious are these three: hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling. So in this way, in the hearing, there are three elements: the receptor element, striker element, and the ignition element. So these are the elements that should be discerned. There is nothing more to it that should be discerned rather than these three elements. So in the hearing, there are the nama, rupa, mentality and materiality arising. The ear, base and the sound wave being the rupa, materiality. Hearing consciousness, hearing contact and hearing feeling are the nama, mentality that are arising at the moment of hearing. And also there are other nama, mentality arising together with the hearing consciousness. So there is ekagata, one-pointedness of the mind. Manasikara is the attention. When the sound wave and the hearing consciousness come into contact, manasikara, conduct, so that the object will be taken by the mind. And there is jivitendriya, the life faculty of the mentality. And there is also jivita, which is the life faculty of materiality. So there is life faculty of both mentality and materiality, which is keeping the mentality and materiality alive. In the mind, together with the mind, there are cetasika, mental factors that are arising together with the mind. So they are called cetasika as they arise connected with the mind. And they are overwhelming the mind. The mind, the consciousness alone is somewhat like transparent, and with the cetasika, mental factors arising together with the consciousness, the mental factors are compared to the dye. So to explain it with the example, water itself is clear and transparent. But if the person adds some dye to it, then the water will change its color. If the person adds yellow color, the water will turn yellow. And if the person adds some black color, the water will turn black. So in the same way, the mind itself is somewhat transparent, and if somewhat transparent, and together with the cetasika mental factors dye the mind. If there are unwholesome cetasika, unwholesome mental states arising, then the mind will also become unwholesome. And if there are wholesome cetasika, wholesome mental factors arising together with the mind, then the mind will also be wholesome. In this way, the cetasika, mental factors, play the role of dyeing the mind. So in the process of hearing, the nama mentalities that are most prominent are the hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling. These are the most prominent, and they are called ignition elements. So in this way, in the process of hearing, there are three elements: the receptor element, striker element, and the ignition element. So these are to be discerned. Together with the hearing, there is sanya, perception, which records whatever is heard. So in the hearing, In the hearing, whether the sound is bad or not, the sanya perception takes record of the sound. So when the striker element strikes the receptor, there is ignition, and the example is given here. In the voice recorder, the voice recorder records the voice regardless of whether it is good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant. In the same way, in the hearing, the sanya perception records regardless of whether the sound is pleasant or unpleasant. And there is also cetana, volition, involved. Hearing takes place as the result, the consequence of deeds that are done in the past life. So cetana, volition in the hearing is not as obvious. But in wholesome mind and unwholesome mind, cetana, volition plays important role in wholesome and unwholesome mind. So in the hearing, sanya perception records the voice, and cetana is not as obvious in the hearing. In the hearing, the three elements, the striker element, receptor element, and the ignition element are arising. But when the yogi is noting as hearing, yogi should not be analyzing whether it is the receptor element, the striker element, or the ignition element. So yogi should not be analyzing as such in theory. At the moment of hearing, yogi should just note it as a whole, just as hearing. And yesterday also, Sayadaw explained by giving the example. When the person wants to recognize another person, the person has to look at the face of the other person. So the other person's face and the person's face should be abhimukha, face to face and direct. So the two faces must be direct, face to face, in order to recognize the person. And the person should look at the other person's face, face to face. So at first, the whole face will be seen, and later on, as the person looks on over some time, then the mind may go on to the other person's forehead, and the person will see the other person's forehead, and same goes with other parts of the face. By looking at the other person's face, the parts of the face will be seen. In the same way, when hearing, yogi should be noting hearing as a whole, just as hearing. And the yogi will discern the element as the yogi notes hearing. And also, when noting, yogi should not just note it just once, but repeatedly, and it should be Anupasana. In the word Anupasana, anu means repeatedly, over and over again. So when hearing, yogi should note repeatedly, hearing, hearing, hearing. Another meaning of anu means pacha, That means when hearing takes place, noting should follow. Noting should follow immediately after the hearing takes place. In order to note hearing, yogi should aim the noting mind onto the hearing. Yogi should be active, alert, ready to note. As soon as the hearing takes place, yogi should note it right away. So, by noting thus, yogi can discern nama, rupa, mentality, and materiality, and yogi will discern the receptor element, striker element, and the ignition element. So yogi should be noting with aiming, directing the mind onto the object, asserting effort, so that the noting mind will reach the object, and thus sati, mindfulness, will develop. When the yogi is mindful, sati, mindfulness develops, and when sati, mindfulness develops, the kilesa defilement that can arise by lack of mindfulness will have no chance to arise. Being mindful at the moment of hearing, yogi will not be attached with the sweet hearing. Oh, the sound is so sweet. In this way, yogi will not be attached. And even if the sound is unpleasant, being mindful of the hearing, yogi will not take it as unpleasant, and thus there will not be anger or hatred. So whatever the sound is, whether pleasant or unpleasant, if the yogi is mindful, having sati, mindfulness, the defilement such as greed or hatred cannot arise concerning with the hearing. And also, when hearing, there will not be delusion concerning with the hearing. So in this way, by being mindful at the moment of hearing, having sati, mindfulness, the unwholesome defilement has no chance to arise connected with the hearing by being mindful. That's why yogis are asked to note hearing as soon as hearing takes place, so that the defilement cannot arise connected with the hearing. At the moment of hearing, in order to note immediately as the hearing takes place, in order to note them immediately, there should be atapa, ardent effort. There should be ardent effort in order to note the object as soon as the object arises. The person who has ardent effort is called atapi. So one should not be cold or sluggish in noting. One should be ready, active, alert, energetic, asserting ardent effort in the practice. One should not be slow, one should not be sluggish, one should not be cold, but one should note with ardent effort. Atapa is the ardent effort. In Satipatthana Sutta, there is atapi. Atapi means the person who has ardent effort. When noting the object, there should also be jhanic factor of vitakka. Vitakka means aiming, directing the noting mind onto the object, so that the noting mind is direct or face to face with the object. So in the noting, these two factors are very important. One should note the object with ardent effort, and one should aim and direct the noting mind onto the object. In the practice of samatha or vipassana, in the beginning of the practice, Paṇḍitā, laziness, can creep in. Laziness is the nearest internal enemy that gives the most trouble. So in order to drive out the laziness, one should have the opposing force in order to drive out the laziness. Ardent effort is the opposing force in order to drive out, in order to overwhelm laziness. So in order to overcome laziness, one should exert ardent effort which can overwhelm. One should not be cold or sluggish. So in order to dispel laziness, one should develop ardent effort which is directly opposing, which is directly opposite of laziness. So in order to be mindful, one should note the object with ardent effort, and also one should aim and direct the noting mind onto the object. Viriya, effort, keeps the person active, alert, and energetic. In noting the object, there should not be laziness, and one should note with ardent effort in order to overwhelm laziness. And also, one should apply aiming, directing the mind onto the object. Aiming, directing the mind onto the object, which is called vitakka, keeps the mind active. Having vitakka, the mind is blossoming, opening, fresh and blossom. So the example is given here. When the sunlight comes, the flower bud blooms into flower. The flower bud blossoms into flower when the sunlight comes. In the same way, when there is vitakka arising, the mind will be blossoming, opening, being fresh. Having vitakka, the mind opens up. With tinamita, cloth and topper, the mind will be constricted and contracted. But when vitakka is present, the mind will blossom, open, and will be fresh. So in this way, tinamita constricts the mind, whereas vitakka blossoms and opens the mind so that the mind is fresh. Having vitakka and viriya, there will not be laziness. Laziness, paṇḍitā, has no chance to arise when the yogi can note the object with vitakka and viriya. If the yogi is lacking either one of the two, or if the yogi is lacking both of these factors, ardent effort and vitakka, then after sitting for a few minutes or just for a while, the yogi starts to become sleepy, nodding, so the laziness has crept in. So in order to drive out the laziness, one should have these two factors, ardent effort as well as the vitakka. Having laziness, the person does not want to exert effort. The mind flinches away from the practice. The person feels exhausted, wanting to take easy in the practice. So in order to drive out the sluggishness, the laziness, yogi should note the object with ardent effort, aiming, directing the noting mind onto the object. So viriya and vitakka are very essential in order to drive out the laziness. Exerting effort in the practice, one overwhelms laziness. As soon as there is hearing taking place, one should be mindful right away. One should notice right away as soon as hearing takes place. Noting, hearing, there will be sati, mindfulness. Mindfulness develops, the mind will stick onto the object, and thus there will be no gap between the mind and the object, but the mind will stick onto the object. The mind will not be distracted. The mind will not scatter, and thus samadhi, concentration, develops. And there will be sati, mindfulness. If there is mindfulness, khanika samadhi, momentary concentration, will automatically develop. When the noting mind sticks onto the object, when there is sati, mindfulness, the person will not take the sound as pleasant or unpleasant, but it will just be mere hearing. Not taking the sound as whether pleasant or unpleasant, then defilement has no chance to arise. Noting hearing at the moment of hearing with ardent effort, having ardent effort, laziness does not arise. When noting hearing, when the noting mind is aimed onto the object, directed onto the object, there is vitakka. Vitakka keeps the mind open, blossom, and fresh. And tinamita, sloth, and torpor has no chance to arise. Vitakka, aiming, directing, is the opposite force of tinamita. As the yogi knows the object, when the noting mind rubs onto the object, the noting will be effective. Yogi will be certain of the object. There will not be uncertainty or doubt. In this way, being mindful of the object by noting with aim and effort, tinamita, sloth and torpor, does not arise. Noting mind rubbing against the object, vicikicca, skeptical doubt, cannot arise. These defilements have no chance to arise. The defilements are blocked from arising. Having sati, mindfulness, the defilements have no chance to arise, and thus the mind will be safe and secure away from the defilements, and there will be goti, security, away from the defilements. Having samadhi, concentration, the mind is kept calm, collected, and unified. The noting mind is calm, collected, and unified, and thus there will not be distraction. Uddhacca, distraction, cannot arise. Kokocca, worry, cannot arise. So in this way, having samadhi, uddhacca and kokocca, distraction and worry has no chance to arise. When the noting is effective, there will not be uncertainty or doubt. Uncertainty or doubt also does not arise. So in this way, having Viriya, Sati and Samadhi, the defilements have no chance to arise. The mental factors that hinder the wholesome mind to arise has no chance to arise. In this way, having Viriya, Sati and Samadhi, the Nivarana hindrances has no chance to arise. And these Nivaranas cannot pollute the mind so long as there is Viriya, Sati and Samadhi. So noting the object, when Viriya, Sati and Samadhi are present, the Nivarana hindrances cannot arise. The hindrances that can weaken the knowledge cannot arise. So Panyaya Dupadi Karana, the hindrances that can weaken the knowledge has no chance to arise. And Sedato Upakilesa, the hindrances that pollute the mind also cannot arise. In this way, by being mindful moment by moment, the mind is free from hindrances, the mental pollutants, defilements, moment by moment, and one can discern Nama and Rupa. So Sayadaw explained how the yogi should be noting as a whole, as hearing at the moment of hearing. So in the hearing, there are receptor elements, striker elements, and ignition elements, and yogis should not be analyzing theoretically at the moment of hearing. Yogis should note as a whole, just as hearing. So it goes the same with seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, knowing. These three elements, the receptor element, striker element, and the ignition element, are arising in the process of seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, knowing, rising, falling, bending, stretching, lifting, moving, and tasting. And when noting, the yogi should just note them as a whole, just as seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and so on. And 1 hour is up, so Sayadaw will finish this talk for today. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.